Good morning. This is Ron. It is Tuesday, April 24th. Welcome to Story Time. Okay, so I'm going to have my four segments today. My editorial, then I'll go ahead and read from Philosophy Who Needs It, Chapter 15, then a critique of Rush Limbaugh, and wind it up with a few jokes from the cab driver's joke book. So my editorial for today is about something I heard about yesterday, and that was that there was a stabbing in Ventura, I believe it was, where a father and husband went with his family to a restaurant, sat down, had his 5-year-old on his lap, and a homeless man walked into the restaurant unprovoked, stabbed him in the neck, and killed him. And so I was listening to the reaction about this on the John and Ken show. And they were outraged, as well they should be, and talking about trying to get people mobilized and saying that the people of Ventura should be, marching on every political politician in the county and demanding that something be done. And there's a problem here, and again, because the most pundits don't see deep into the situation and figure and understand truly what's causing a lot of the actions or reactions on the part of political figures, then they go wrong. They have a tendency to lash out in general. They know something is wrong, but they can't quite put their finger on exactly what it is that's wrong. And it's so very, very important to know that. In order to explain it, I have to go into talking about some of the dogmas of the left. And one of the dogmas of the left, one of the things that the left wants and has always wanted is socialist paradise. And for the left, in a lot of cases, most cases, that what they mean by paradise is no more capitalism, at the very least. Okay, so we don't have a capitalistic society. Nobody really owns any property. Everybody peaceably trades amongst themselves. There's no rich people. There's no poor people, and that's pretty much the perfect society. There's some that want to go even farther than that and figure, why do we need to stop at that? And why can't we have a society in which nobody dies, nobody ever gets sick, nobody has accidents, etc.? So, but taking it either way, what is happening when you've got a lot of people on the left that are running the government, whether it's a city government or a state government, and you have problems that the people come and say, do something about, is that the politicians then say, oh, that's fine. Of course we'll do something about it. Well, what the politicians mean is, we're not going to try to solve that problem directly. We're going to solve it indirectly by trying to create the perfect society. Because according to post-Marxist dogma, the perfect society would have no homelessness in this particular, from taking this particular situation. So in other words, the way to solve the problem of getting stabbed by some crazy homeless guy is to eliminate homelessness. And if you can eliminate homelessness, then again, then you don't have the problem at all. The problem with this whole idea of paradise is that, number one, it can't be done wholesale. You can't do it all at once, but it can't be done piecemeal either. And that's what the politicians end up trying to do, is trying to create paradise piecemeal. You can't have paradise in terms of a perfect, let's say, perfection in terms of socioeconomics if you have an imperfect criminal justice system, and vice versa. And there's you can't have it socioeconomic perfection if you have an imperfect political system, for that matter. So but the politicians who are what they call possibility thinkers, like to get into possibility thinking, and again, they're going to create the perfect society. It is the reason for this guy getting stabbed is not their fault as far as they're concerned. It's not because they're not providing adequate security. It's not because they're not putting people like this guy in jail or in mental institutions where perhaps they belong. But it is actually the fault of capitalism. If it wasn't for evil greedy developers and evil, greedy uh, uh, landlords that charge high rents, then everything would be perfect. Nobody would be homeless, and stabbings such as what happened over the weekend would be no more. But the fact of the matter is that that's not so. But the problem is people like John and Ken and Rush Limbaugh and whatnot don't understand that this is where these politicians are coming from. Look at this. One of the ways you can tell is with Mayor Garcetti's zero, um, what does he call it? Call it Vision Zero or Hallucination Zero or whatever. And it's about zeroing out traffic deaths. That there have been plenty of pedestrians that have been getting killed by motor vehicles. Now, it used to be 50 years ago that a politician found that there was a problem in society, let's say a high crime rate. Let's say that you had a murder rate of 150 per year. The politician would approach it from a realistic standpoint and would say, okay, my goal as mayor is to reduce the murder rate in this city by X amount percent. Let's say pull a figure out of the thin air and call it 25%. Okay, and this is the way I plan to do it. I'm going to put X amount more police officers on the street. I'm going to increase penalties for murder or increase sentences. Yeah, penalties or sentences for murder. I'm going to get with the DA to make sure that more individuals are prosecuted for or are getting the death penalty or up for the death penalty. Whatever their particular remedy is, the point is that they were realistic. They didn't come out and say, well, my goal is to eliminate the murder rate and have a zero murder city. Because that's idealistic and it is utopian. And again, unless you can make all portions of society perfect at one time, you're not going to be able to do it piecemeal. You can't make the criminal justice system perfect when you have an imperfect socioeconomic system or an imperfect political system. And I say that as a matter of common sense. So when you go out and run out and say, but do something, do something. And I noticed on the news this morning that the people of Ventura did go out to some either city council or county supervisor meeting, and they were screaming about, you need to do something, you need to do something. And the politicians are going to be glad to do something. They're going to go ahead and try to, instead of addressing the problem directly, which means let's go ahead and put these folks in jail or in let's enforce the laws with regards to the homeless the same way we would enforce the laws with regards to anyone else. The homeless are not special. They're not super citizens. They deserve no special breaks, because ultimately that's what needs to happen here. The politicians got out and said, we're going to go easy on the homeless. We're going to go. We're not going to prosecute them. We're not going to cite them if they poop on the sidewalk, if they litter, if they trespass. We're not going to bother to do that. And why? Because as far as they're concerned, that's not the problem. The problem is capitalism, and that it is because of property ownership that the issue of homelessness becomes an issue. And then if they can simply go ahead and overcome capitalism and the capitalistic impulses, in one case by going ahead and creating, as the mayor of Los Angeles, Garcetti, said, by creating the rent control. So that's the latest proposal, latest socialist answer or non-answer to this problem is to try to create rent control. And the idea is then you can keep the rents lower, again, reduce or eliminate the number of homeless, and thereby reduce or eliminate the problems associated with homelessness. But it's BS because it's all based on determinism. The idea that folks are homeless they're forced to be homeless because of powers beyond their control. i.e., ultimately capitalism, and that it is the job of the government to provide counterforce in order to straighten the situation out. And it's baloney. People are the way they are and do what they do because of free will. We know that by the evidence of our senses. People are homeless or they may have come by homelessness by accident through um, means or situation not of their own making. They lost their job, etc. But even then, it's a lot of that is still of their free will. Did they have savings enough to carry them through their period of unemployment? That kind of thing. But the point is that once they're on the street, they have the free will to decide to get off the street. If they're having psychotic problems, they have the free will to go to a doctor, to get medication, and to then rehabilitate themselves. They have the free will, if they are alcoholic or drug addicted, to beat those addictions. Those addictions, those diseases are treatable. Not curable, but they are treatable, and people can go on to live very productive lives. But these individuals choose not to for whatever reason. Because they want to continue to use or abuse drugs and alcohol, because they find the lifestyle comfortable, whatever the situation may be. It is their choice, and that means that they should be held to the same levels and standards of responsibility everyone else is being held to. I have free will, and I can go out and decide to speed in my car. I can go out and, as a matter of fact, a few months ago, I got a ticket for making an illegal right turn on a red signal. Okay, I made the choice through my free will to go ahead and do that, and I was held accountable. Police officer pulled me over, gave me a ticket. I've had to pay a fine, and I'm going to have to go to traffic school, etc. Same thing applies to the homeless. You're homeless doesn't mean you get to trespass, doesn't mean that you get to foul the streets. It doesn't mean that you get to commit crimes. Need to be held to the same standards everyone else would be held to. So, yeah, people need to be aware, the pundits especially, of the effects of philosophy, the effects of the understanding that philosophy is the underpinning of everything. The philosophical theories that you bring to everyday life is going to shape your life, is going to shape society, is going to shape the country. Okay, when I come back, it is going to be time for chapter 15 of Ayn Rand, Philosophy, Who Needs It? Okay, I'm back, and chapter 15, Censorship, Local and Express from Philosophy, Who Needs It? And in this chapter, Ayn Rand is analyzing and critiquing 5 decisions from the Supreme Court from the 1970s, the decisions that were made about obscenity cases and their effects on free speech. And when we concluded the last part of this, she was analyzing Chief Justice Burger's. He wrote the opinion for the majority, and so she was analyzing, critiquing that. The ugly hand of altruism slithers into the decision. In a passage that sideswipes the concept of free will, quote, "We have just noted, for example, that neither the First Amendment nor free will precludes states from having blue sky laws to regulate what sellers of securities may write or publish about their wares. Such laws are to protect the weak, the uninformed, the unsuspecting, and the gullible from the exercise of their own volition." Unquote. It is for this kind of purpose that the rest of us, who are not weak, uninformed, unsuspecting, and gullible, are to be protected from our volition and deprived of the right to exercise it. So much for the relation of altruism to rights and to freedom. Here's another chicken flying home. Quote, "States are told by some that they must await a laissez-faire market solution to the obscenity pornography problem. Paradoxically, by people who have never otherwise had a kind word to say for laissez-faire, particularly in solving urban, commercial, and environmental pollution problems." Unquote. The decision contains many other homing chickens of this kind, an entire barnyard of them, many more than I have space to quote, but these are sufficient to give you the nature, style, and spirit of that ruling. In his dissenting opinion, Justice Brennan, joined by Justice Stewart and Marshall, offers some good arguments to support the conclusion that censorship in regard to consenting adults is unconstitutional. But he wavers, hesitates to go that far, and tries to compromise, to strike, quote, a better balance between the guarantee of free expression and the state's legitimate interests, unquote. He concedes the notion that obscene material is not protected by the First Amendment, but expresses an anxious concern over the court's failure to draw a clear line between protected and unprotected speech. He cites the chaotic, contradictory record of the court's decisions in obscenity cases, but sidesteps the issue by saying, in a footnote, quote, whether or not a class of obscene and thus entirely unprotected speech does exist, I am forced to conclude that the class is incapable of definition with sufficient clarity to withstand attack on vagueness grounds. Accordingly, it is on principles of the void for vagueness doctrine that this opinion exclusively relies. Unquote. Justice Brennan speaks eloquently about the danger of vague laws and quotes Chief Justice Warren, who said that, quote, the constitutional requirement of definiteness is violated by a criminal statute that fails to give a person of ordinary intelligence fair notice that his contemplated conduct is forbidden by the statute, unquote. But Justice Brennan does not mention the antitrust laws, which do just that. He states, quote, the resulting level of uncertainty is utterly intolerable, not alone because it makes book selling a hazardous profession, but as well because it invites arbitrary and erratic enforcement of the law, unquote. He deplores the fact that obscenity judgments are now made on a, quote, case-by-case, site-by-site basis, unquote. He observes that the court has been struggling, quote, to fend off legislative attempts to bypass the courts and ultimately the Supreme Court. The awesome task, or to fob off on the courts and ultimately the Supreme Court, the awesome task of making case by case at once the criminal and constitutional law, unquote. But he does not mention the living hell of antitrust, the grim monument to law made case by case. However, a greater respect for principles and greater understanding of their consequences are revealed in Justice Brennan's dissenting opinion than in the majority decision. He declares that on the basis of that majority decision, quote, it is hard to see how state-ordered regimentation of our minds can ever be forestalled. For if a state may, in an effort to maintain or create a particular moral tone, prescribe what its citizens cannot read or cannot see, then it would seem to follow that in pursuit of that same objective, a state could decree that its citizens must read certain books or must view certain films, unquote. The best statement, however, is made again by Justice Douglas, who ends his forceful dissent with the words, quote, but our society, unlike most in the world, presupposes that freedom and liberty are in a frame of reference that make the individual, not government, the keeper of his tastes, beliefs, and ideas. That is the philosophy of the First Amendment, and it is the article of faith that sets us apart from most nations in the world, unquote. I concur, except that it is not an, quote, article of faith, unquote, but a provable, rational conviction. In the life of a nation, the law plays the same role as a decision-making process of thought does in the life of an individual. An individual makes decisions by applying his basic premises to a specific choice, premises which he can change but seldom does. The basic premises of a nation's laws are set by its dominant political philosophy and implemented by the courts, whose task is to determine the application of broad principles to specific cases. In this task, the equivalent of basic premises is precedent, which can be challenged but seldom is. How far a loosely worded piece of legislation can go in the role of precedent is horrifyingly demonstrated by the Supreme Court's majority decision in another one of the 5 obscenity cases, U.S. versus Orito. This case involves a man charged with knowingly transporting obscene material by common carrier in interstate commerce. The clause giving Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce is one of the major errors in the Constitution. That clause, more than any other, was the crack in the Constitution's foundation, the entering wedge of statism, which permitted the gradual establishment of the welfare state. But I would venture to say that the framers of the Constitution could not have conceived of what the clause has now become. If, in writing it, one of the goals was to facilitate the flow of trade and prevent the establishment of trade barriers among states, that clause has reached the opposite destination. You may now expect 50 different frontiers inside this country, with customs officials searching your luggage and pockets for books or magazines permitted in one state, but prohibited in another. Chief Justice Berger's decision declares, quoting an earlier decision, quote, "The motive and purpose of a regulation of interstate commerce are matters for the legislative judgment, upon the exercise of which the Constitution places no restriction and over which the courts are given no control," unquote. Such an interpretation means that the legislative judgment is given an absolute power, beyond the restraint of any principle, beyond the reach of any checks or balances. This is an outrageous instance of context dropping. The Constitution, taken as a whole, is a fundamental restriction on the power of the government, whether in the legislative or in any other branch. And so that's where I'm going to stop here on this part of Censorship, Local, and Express, Chapter 15 of Philosophy Who Needs It by Ayn Rand. And again, I think she makes an excellent case for, she's absolutely right that basically the courts contradict themselves. They say, on the one hand, that yes, we should have free speech and the individual should be allowed to operate as they see fit, decide what their tastes are, etc. But on the other hand, when it comes to antitrust, the individual is not to be trusted, and the government must not only fail to defend an individual's right to free speech, but must actively impinge on that right. So when I come back, it is going to be another reading and critique of Rush Limbaugh, and we'll go from there. Okay, I'm back, and this segment again is a Rush Limbaugh segment, and it's from his show on April 23rd, yesterday, and it is entitled "The Beginning of the End of the Russia Hoax." Now, it is the head masked, the words over the top of it say, "Don't doubt me." That's one of his favorite statements, and it is so full of crap, I can't stand it. It makes me want to barf. Because basically what he is saying is, trust me or take my word for it. Take my word for it is one of the oldest fallacies in the world. It sounds good, but when you think about it, it's BS. Nobody should take anybody's word for it. You should demand from the person that is speaking, that is trying to prove something, trying to make a point, evidence and proof for their arguments. And absent any evidence or proof for their arguments, their statements should be treated as arbitrary and ignored. Rush, I think it was, let's see, this is April, March. It was about 14 and a half, maybe 15 months ago, and I was appearing on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace. And he asked me a question about something, and my answer was, before I get into that, Chris, I just want to tell you this whole idea that the Russians had anything to do with the outcome of the presidential election is absurd. The idea they colluded or tampered or worked with Donald Trump to do it is doubly absurd. There is nothing to it. And I remember telling him I'm astounded. I'm astounded that there isn't one voice inside Washington that wants to even challenge this concept. Somebody says it, they all run with it. And I said it's stunning the group think on this. That was 15 months ago, and from that time on to the present, I've been consistent. I've never believed that the Russians had anything to do with the outcome of our election, this one, or any other previous election. Let's see. For a year and a half, we've been subjected to, I don't know what the word is, sham, scam, hoax, whatever it is. There have been a lot of conspirators, and they've been eagerly conspiring knowingly together. The conspirators include 99% of the American drive-by media, several people in the intelligence apparatus of the United States, in the CIA, the DIA, the NSA, take your pick. We've had Democrat members of Congress, Democrat members of the Senate, and we've had several never-Trumpers on the Republican/conservative side. We've had several conservative bloggers who've all believed it or wanted to be true and treated it as though, quote, well, it could be. We don't have a choice. We've got to cover this as though it did happen. In case it did, we can say we were on the right side of it all along, unquote. And during this entire 15-month period, the number of people actually employing common sense, with everything known about this, with all the trumped up information that we would eventually learn, such as Hillary Clinton buying the dossier that was used for all of this, there still was nobody willing to back off of it. Of course, Miller wasn't going to back off of it. This is the most amazing thing. Last week on this program, the middle of last week, I told you I remember the phraseology that I used. Folks, I'm going to go out on a limb here. You remember? I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to tell you, this is shortly after the president hired Rudy to be his lawyer and liaison to the Mueller investigation. I said, we are now at the beginning of the end of this, and this is so powerful. The whole idea is so powerful that even people smarter than I am who know everything I know and think everything I think are still wary of backing off of it because it could be true. It has never been true. There's never been any evidence, and so last week I went out on a limb to tell you that it was the beginning of the end, and we're going to soon see the Democrats drop this. Then the Democrats announced their lawsuit, that lunatic Tom Perez, who runs the DNC, when he announced their civil lawsuit. Well, to me, that was a sign that this is over. Then over the weekend, I and my climbing out on the limb were validated. Two little things. Actually, there's more than two, but here's the first. Mara Liasson, definitely a member of the Swamp, stated that she doesn't think Russia is a voting issue. And Democrats who've been successful know that when you look at the list of issues that voters care about, Russia is way down at the bottom. Let's see. So now he's going to go on with a show called Homeland. And so, anyways, one of the critique that I wanted to make of this, number one, like I said, is where he says, "Don't doubt me," which is just another way of saying, "Trust me" or "Take my word for it." You got to produce evidence, and all he's produced is an interview that he had with Chris Wallace, his recollections of an interview that he happened to have with Chris Wallace, in which he makes a statement that there's nothing to it. And he is right about that, and he is right to say that there was no evidence for it. And but what he forgot to say was it should be ignored. It's an arbitrary statement, and it should therefore be ignored. The thing that's interesting in here also is his making predictions and bragging about making correct predictions. And making predictions is really for losers. A lot of things, particularly man-made realities, are very difficult, if not impossible, to predict. If you predict something and it comes true, then most of the time it's just simply luck. It had nothing to do with intelligence or skill. It's just plain luck. But the left wants to pretend that intelligence now is no longer a sign of how fast you learn or how much information you possess, but is one's ability to make accurate predictions. You'll hear that all the time on the radio and on television, interviewers and others asking the question, what do you predict will happen? What do you think how is this going to play out? What is going to be the ultimate result? Well, the true and honest answer is we don't know. We're going to just have to wait and see how all of this plays out. So, also making predictions is an excellent way of avoiding ethics and avoiding should statements. Because basically, when you're getting into ethics, that's what it comes right down to when you're communicating with people, is making judgments, making value judgments, saying what should or should not happen. So instead of saying, well, what will happen is X, what he should be doing is saying, this is what should happen. What should happen is that there should be no investigation of the Russia collusion situation without evidence, without what is it that they normally use in criminal cases for um, let's see, in criminal cases for what is the standard if they're going to proceed? Probable cause. You have to have some kind of probable cause. You have to have some level of evidence that shows that there's a reason to go ahead and conduct an investigation. Otherwise, it just becomes just like Donald Trump has claimed all along, a political witch hunt. And you end up wasting money and end up wasting time. So, what Rush Limbaugh should have done here is say that this is what should happen, that the investigation shouldn't occur at all. Now that it has occurred, it should be wound up. What is it that the president should do vis-a-vis Mueller, for instance? Should he fire Mueller or should he not? And I'm talking not from necessarily from a political standpoint, but from a moral or ethical standpoint. If Mueller is going ahead and investigating something that doesn't need to be investigated, there's no evidence of any wrongdoing, then there's no point in him continuing. There's no point in having a special counsel. So again, when Rush Limbaugh falls into the habit of doing what the left wants done, of aping the left, because this is what that's where he got this idea of making predictions, is listening to people on the left make predictions. Scrupulously avoid making should statements, scrupulously avoid making value statements, and sticking instead to predictions. So he apes the left, and by so doing, undermines conservative orthodoxy, for lack of a better term. He undercuts his own conservative. Uh, he becomes inconsistently conservative. So it hurts his integrity, it hurts his credibility, and it hurts his ability to influence people, influence the culture, and influence political debate. Okay, when I come back, it's going to be the New York City cab driver's joke book. Okay, so I'm back, and we are at the New York City cab driver's joke book. And so let's see. Try to figure out where I left off. There it is. Okay. The phone rings in the home of a middle-aged Jewish woman. She picks it up, and on the other end is an obscene phone caller. He begins telling her in great detail all the perverted, sexual things he wants to do to her. Then she says, "All of this you know from just me saying hello?" A man goes to his doctor for a checkup, and the doctor tells him, "I'm afraid I must operate immediately." "But," says the man, "I feel fine." "I'm sorry," says the doctor, "but I just checked you, and you must have this operation. It will be very difficult to perform, and it will cost you $5,000. "But I don't have that much money," says the man. "That's all right," answers the doctor. "You don't have to pay it all at once. You can pay it in installments, paying a little every month." "Oh," replies the man, "like you're buying a car." "Yeah, I am," says the doctor. A well-dressed gentleman wearing an overcoat and a hat arrives at a train station with two large suitcases. Because of their great weight, they cause him to walk in a very hunched-over way. He gets in line for the tickets, and just as a man gets in line behind him, he looks at his watch and says, "I think I'll start coffee at home. I should be home in about an hour." So he punches it in on his watch, and the computer starts his coffee at home. Then he says, "I guess I'll check the stock market." He pushes another little button on his watch, and out comes the ticker tape. And he reads it with interest. The man behind him in line taps him on the shoulder. "Excuse me, sir, but I can't help but notice this watch you have. It's unbelievable. What else does it do?" "Well, this button can tell the time in all different parts of the world. This button wakes me up in the morning. This button activates the calculator. This button interfaces with my computer at home. This watch can do just about anything." And in so saying, the man picks up his two heavy suitcases and with great effort moves a couple of steps forward in line. The man behind him is obviously impressed. "That's really quite remarkable," he says. "Do you think I could possibly get one of those?" "Sure," says the man with the watch. "I could get you one with no problem." He, he thinks for a moment, then he says, "Say, do you want this one?" The other man says, "I couldn't take your only watch." First man says, "Oh, I can get another one. It's no big deal." And then he slides his two heavy bags a few feet forward in line. "Well," says the second man, "how much would you want for that watch?" The man answers, "Why don't you give me $300?" $300 for this incredible machine? Wow. I'm glad I just went to the bank. He takes out his wallet and says, "Gee, do you mind if I just try it on for a minute right here?" "No, go right ahead," says the man. So the new owner of the watch puts it on and pushes a button. The time in all different parts of the world comes up. He pushes another button and the ticker tape starts coming out. He pushes another button, up comes the computer readout. "This is just great," he exclaims. Here's the $300. I've got to run and tell my friend." And as he's running from the line, the first gentleman calls after him. "Hey," he says, reaching toward the suitcases, "don't you want the batteries?" Where do you find the most fish? Between the head and the tail. And that'll do it for today's episode of Story Time. And thank you very much for joining me. And until tomorrow, have a great day.